Read chapter 11, page 457. A Constant New Creation, 1860 to 1862. Thoreau Emerson says, "The country knows not yet, or in the least part, how great a son it has lost." He's probably writing about Thoreau. Awake, the year of Darwin. Remember Darwin, evolution of species? Awake to winter, unquote, Thoreau noted. Awake to winter. Are you awake to winter? Do you wake up when it's winter? It was December 4th, 1859. Though the morning after he had smuggled Mr. X to safety, he smuggled some major player in the John Brown event incident to Canada. He's like a criminal. Marry him or somebody. All week he had been reflecting on the changes he was witnessing. Quote, "The North is suddenly all transcendental," quote, able to recognize justice and glory in Brown's apparent failure. Even little children were asking their parents why God didn't save John Brown. Now that the work of translating Brown to sainthood was going forward all around him, Thoreau's mind was clarified and at peace. It struck him that the recent death of Washington Irving, that giant of American literature, he's a giant, had passed unremarked. Real literature that mattered, wasn't conned like Irving's from the dictionaries, but fired like a bullet from a rifle. Quote, "If I were a professor of rhetoric, I should insist on this," unquote. The writer must, quote, "speak the truth. This first, this second, and this third." With that settled, Thoreau swapped his summer shoes for his winter boots and set off on a winter walk. There's some people, they'll walk the Appalachian Trail in winter. They walk to Mount Washington in winter, the presidential range, if you're a hardcore professional hiker. Thoreau was 42, old enough to have watched forests fall, but also old enough to see new forests spring up from barren fields. At Walden the snow set off his rows of sturdy little trees. Quote, "What a change there will be in a few years, this little forest of goldenrod giving place to a pine forest as winter deepened." As winter deepened, he found new life everywhere. He finds it in winter. The gardener at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery told him they caught pouts and a little hefty pickerel in the pond. Thoreau designed just months after workmen finished it. With no outlet and only a faint inlet, the fish found their way. The artificial pond was full of life. It was all about seeds, he reflected. Every new tree must come from a seed. Now he's a seed collector. Take care of your seeds and you will have the woods again. So where did the seeds come from? The new fallen snow was already covered with them. Fine seeds of birches and alders, blown and everywhere by the wind. One day he came across bits of frozen thawed apple on the snow under an oak tree. How? Ah, crow tracks. Crows like the sweet, cidery buzz as much as he. By dropping the seeds on the snow, they were planting wild apples for the future. Everywhere Thoreau looked, he saw tracks, even in the heart of winter. The earth below, the skies above, and the woods around throbbed with life. He could even hear it. Quote, the crow flying high touches the tympanum of the sky for us and reveals the tone of it. On New Year's Day, 1860, Thoreau walked to Sanborn's for a dinner party with Bronson Alcott and Sanborn's reformist friend, Charles Loring Brace, a Unitarian minister. An ardent abolitionist in town to lecture on his Children's Aid Society, which he founded in New York City to give orphans and street children free schooling, medical care, homes, and jobs. Brace had just been visiting his aunt and uncle, Professor and Mrs. Usha Gray in Cambridge, where the renowned botanist had just finished reading a new book by an old friend. Here we go. Old friend. Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species. Published in London 5 weeks before. Darwin had posted an advance copy to Gray, who lent it to Brace, who showed it to Sanborn, Alcott, and Thoreau. All afternoon the four friends read Origin of Species aloud to one another and discussed Darwin's extraordinary principle of natural selection. Darwin declared Brace had just exploded the scientific basis for slavery. Louisa Gossig, who hadn't seen the book yet but hated it when he did, held that all natural species were separately created by God and changed through eternity. Do you believe in creationism or evolutionism? Why couldn't God create evolution? Gossig, the frogs, Thoreau found atop Mount Monadnock were indeed, Gossig would insist, created by God right there among the rocks. The same was true for humankind. God has separately created each race as an unchanging natural species not to be mixed. Wow, there. The races are getting all mixed up, right? We all came from one black guy in Africa, let's face it. Of them all, only one, the white race, was fully human. All others were lesser creations. Some of them he named the African race closer to chimpanzees. That's some friend of his. Darwin barely mentioned human beings in Origin, lest the resulting controversy prevent a fair hearing of his theory of evolution. But the foreman in Sanborn's parlor that day understood exactly what Darwin's breakthrough meant for human beings, as Sanborn put it in an excited letter to Theodore Parker. Darwin showed, quote, that one race can be derived from another, which meant to this gathering of abolitionists and John Brown supporters not only that all animals were related by common descent, but so were all human beings. Darwin knocked away the scientific foundation of racism, for if all human races were interrelated, then slavery was a moral abomination. All races everywhere in the world were biologically human, and humans of all shapes, sizes, and colors were a unity in diversity, one single family, which is true. You think we're all just one family? We come from Adam and Eve, uh, one man and one woman. Darwin's revolutionary book would take on many meanings over the years, but on this New Year's Day, for the four radicals in Sanborn's parlor, Origin of Species was first and foremost an argument debunking the so-called scientific basis for slavery. Brace went on to write his own book, using Darwin's theory to refute the American racial science promoted by pro-slavery apologists such as Agassiz. Thoreau, too, would use Darwin to further his work. Over the next month he read Origin carefully, copying several pages of extracts into a notebook, making Thoreau one of the very first Americans to read Darwin's Origin from cover to cover on American soil. So he's not just some woods hiker, he reads, right? The passages Thoreau copied show he followed Darwin's argument closely, and noting specific instances, he could verify for himself evidence that common domestic animals had wild origins, plus several facts showing the explanatory power of natural selection. Why do precisely these objects we behold make a world? Unquote, he had asked in Walden. Ever since Thoreau had studied patterns of growth and destruction, regrowth and adaptation, though early in Walden, he had celebrated the economic freedom of the seedless cypress. His interest shifted to the ecological freedom of generation and creation. All the objects he beheld, herons, owls, and chickadees, woodchucks, frogs, and flying squirrels, wood rushes and willows, pines and oaks, lived precisely there because somehow a seed had found that place and flourished. The key was to study how seeds moved around, like the birch and alder seeds carried by the wind, the apple seeds carried by a cider-drunk crows. Do you think the crows get drunk on cider? They've been drinking. They've been drinking now. If the apples are rotten, do you think they get drunk on them? The acorns buried by squirrels, even the annoying beggar tick seeds that hitched a ride on his pant legs, landing wherever he sat down to pick them off. They have these seeds that stick to your pants. Thoreau copied out Darwin's point that the plants and animals found on ocean islands always resembled those on the neighboring mainland. Hence, not created there, Thoreau added triumphantly. Take that, Louis Agassiz. He was a fool, apparently. Darwin told Thoreau he was on the right path. There was always a seed. There were always tracks, there on the ground or in the water or the air, to be followed. Man only receives what he is ready to receive, he wrote 3 days after his Darwin dinner. We hear and apprehend only what we already half know. Even man thus tracks himself through life. Do you think we only apprehend things that we already half know?
Yeah, so we also discover things.
We only have You have to have a clue, or you can't even. We only hear what we already believe. Mhm. Mm. I'm completely deaf. If I don't know something already, I can't earn it. With John Brown behind him and autumnal tints done, Thoreau turned to wild apples. Quote, wild apples. This may be like, another essay or lecture. Ever since 1855 he had been writing of his relish for the crabbed, scrappy apples on federal trees or in abandoned orchards. Do you like wild apples? You don't like them. On February 8, 1860, he stepped to the podium at Concord Lyceum to celebrate, in Alcott's words, quote, the infinity of nature, unquote. From the apple in Eden to the wildings in Concord's woods, Sanborn called the lecture, quote, full of juice and queer wit. Does he have queer wit? And one Concord schoolboy thought it the best of the season. The audience long applauded the man who, though the Lyceum had nurtured his career for 3 decades, only now stood revealed to them all. Quote, wild apples, unquote, is quintessential Thoreau, a puckish autobiography in apples. Quote, wild only like myself, who belong not to the aboriginal race here, but have strayed into the woods from the cultivated stock. Do you think Thoreau is wild like the apples? It's like autobiographical. The scrubby little trees, browsed by cattle in their youth, put out stiff, thorny branches to fence themselves from harm, until, after 20 years or more, some interior shoot which their foes cannot reach darts upward with joy, for it has not forgotten its high calling and bears its own peculiar fruit in triumph. They're saying like the tree starts out thorny to protect itself, and then produces fruit in triumph. Thoreau repeated his spicy autumn brew of wit, wisdom, and sorrow on February 14th at the Bedford Lyceum. The audience of 200 were pleased and surprised by it. It was a good lecture, a lecture with legs, but he never got a chance to deliver it again. The winter of 1860 served up plenty of the cold, glittering days Thoreau liked best for river walking, quote, a solid crystalline sky under our feet, unquote, and he filled his journal with sketches of ice forms. Do you like artistic sketches of ice forms by Thoreau? Even after all these years, there was no end to wonder. Quote, thought breeds thought. Thought breeds thought. It grows under your hands, unquote. He turned from reading Darwin, the cutting edge of science, to reading the oldest naturalist, Aristotle, Topsell, Gessner, Gerard's Herbal. Seeking the roots of ideas in words pungent as wild apples, early in March he met a group of Indians setting up camp on Brister's Hill, who asked him where to find the rare black ash they needed for their baskets. 6 days later they had their distinctive split-wood baskets hanging out on the trees for sale, including a solid bushel basket with, he noticed, a white oak rim. Were not baskets of that size and style an Indian invention? Question mark. Everywhere he looked he saw invention and adaptation, artistry and resilience. He saw this in his Concord friends as well, or had not, as his friends feared, been lured back to the California gold fields, but stayed to marry the learned and quick-witted Elizabeth Pritchard, and Henry's friend since childhood, literally, the girl next door. Ed, who hankered for a country life, bought a nearby farm, which Henry surveyed for him at the end of March, and from then on, visits with Ed and Lizzie Hoare were a regular part of Henry's life. Once in Alcott, too, found new life. In 1859, the town of Concord had hired the old educational reformer to be the superintendent of the Concord School District. The rejuvenated Alcott plunged into the work, converting a routine appointment into his chance to create a model public school system. Alcott's first annual report announced an important collaboration. Henry Thoreau had agreed to prepare a small textbook for the schools comprising the geography, history, and antiquities of Concord. By 1860, he was calling this the Atlas of Concord and was urging community support. Quote, happily, we have a sort of resident surveyor general, unquote, whose, quote, illustrated atlas for the citizens, unquote, would be a model for outdoor education, a gift to our children and to us all. Quote, the town shall find ways of using its best men, unquote, editorialized the new superintendent. Does that sound good? Never read Darwin's Origin of Species. Have you been to the Galapagos Islands? No, I haven't. Intendant. That May when Thoreau joined the wedding dance around Anna Alcott and John Pratt, he must have known that Anna's sister Louisa planned to be a writer. As in Louisa May Alcott, but he may not have known that she was already drafting her novel Moods, in which her heroine must choose between two lovers, one a serene and kindly minister, who teaches her the wisdom of self-governance, the other a dashing, naturalist explorer who liberates her deepest desires. Dear, which do you prefer? Her thinly disguised portraits of Emerson and Thoreau hint at layers of feeling hidden beneath the few surviving anecdotes, letters, and fragmentary journals. When Louisa saw Emerson kissing the bride, she thought, quote, the honor would make an even matrimony endurable, for he is the god of my idolatry, unquote. As for Thoreau, he was, she wrote, already married to, quote, Swallow and Aster, Lake and Pine. Do you hear that? Louisa May Alcott, he says that Thoreau is already married to the Swallow, Aster, Lake, and Pine. He's married to trees, basically. He's not available. So Hawthorne, now we have Hawthorne. We're talking about the town where half of all American literature came from, Concord. Oh. Thoreau, or Hawthorne too, had transfigured Thoreau into fiction. The title character of his novel, Marble Faun, published early 1860, incarnated the half-wild qualities Hawthorne had seen in Thoreau years before. In June 1860, 7 years after they left Concord for Europe, the Hawthornes returned. The day they had arrived, Abba and Bronson Alcott, their new neighbors, dropped in to say hello amid the chaos of trunks and suitcases. Do we have a chaos of trunks and suitcases? And the next afternoon, the Emersons threw a welcome home party, where over strawberries and cream the Hawthornes were created by friends old and new. Thoreau, ignoring Nathaniel's silvered hair, wrote his sister that his old friend had not altered beyond a suntan from the steamship voyage home, as simple and childlike as ever. The newcomer Sanborn was awestruck. Nothing had prepared him for the famous novelist's, quote, remarkable personal beauty. Do you think that Nathaniel Hawthorne had remarkable personal beauty from having written books or read books or from being an author or living in Concord, which made him by far, quote, the most distinguished in appearance of all the Concord authors? Sophia Hawthorne quickly made herself at home. Her sister, Mary Peabody Mann, had moved into the Wayside after the death of her husband, the renowned educator Horace Mann. Upon the Hawthornes' return, Mary moved into her own house on Sudbury Road, conveniently next to Sanborn School, which enrolled both her son, Horace Jr., and Julian Hawthorne. Why was he distinguished looking? Nathaniel, though, found no place in Concord life. Concord had changed, and despite Henry's assurance, so had he. His old friends had wound themselves out tightly into crisis of American democracy that a newly cosmopolitan Hawthorne found repugnant. They were all too political. They were watching the election. He was cosmopolitan, and they just kept watching the news about politics. Bronson Alcott observed sadly how the coy genius never called on anyone, never attended any lectures, seldom left the improbable Italianate tower he added into the somber New England house, keeping, quote, his moats wide and deep, his drawbridges all up on all sides. He just stayed home and meditated, I guess. Thoreau breached those moats at least a few times. On August 20th, he surveyed Hawthorne's 20-acre property, startling 9-year-old Rose with his, quote, enormous eyes, wild as an animal's, and, quote, gray as autumn pools lit by a rift in the clouds. Thoreau's eyes haunted Nathaniel, too. As he struggled in his sky parlor to draft his next novel, he hit on a story of Concord's own fictional Septimius Fieldtone, quote, a hermit-like scholar with Indian blood in his veins who killed a British soldier hand to hand in the heat of the Concord battle. Hawthorne never completed the sketch of Thoreau he planned for the preface, perhaps because his fictional descriptions said it all. Ever, quote, brooding, with his eyes fixed on some ship, some stone, some common plant, as if it were the clue and index to some mystery. When he lifted his eyes, quote, there would be a kind of perplexity, a dissatisfied wild look in them, as if of his speculations he found no end. Thoreau was working his way into the minds of the writers around him, already finding his biographers. Given Hawthorne's horror at the shrill and toxic turn in American politics, it was fortunate he returned just as the worst aftershocks of John Brown's insurrection were subsiding. After Brown's execution, Sanborn opened his school free of charge to Brown's daughters, Annie and Sarah. When they arrived in February, Cynthia and Sophia held a welcoming party for them at the Thoreaus, where Annie, a precocious 16-year-old, told Alcott that Henry Thoreau reminded her of her father. What Henry thought of Annie doesn't survive, but she must have made an impression. During preparations for the Harper's Ferry raid, she ran the nearby farm her father had purchased as cover for his conspiratorial meetings. The Thoreaus, Emersons, Alcotts, and others pitched in to provide clothing and lodging for Brown's daughters. And Sophia Thoreau organized a quilting bee at which the women of the town made a comforter for their mother, Mary Brown. Do you know how to make a comforter? Each square embroidered with a telling quotation. They put quotations in the quilt. That's very old-fashioned. Such aid and comfort to John Brown's family was an act of militant defiance. Even as his daughters were being welcomed to Concord, a Senate investigating committee issued a summons to anyone suspected of complicity with John Brown. James Redpath refused his summons and went into hiding, sending Thoreau his address in secret to pass along to Sanborn, who had also ignored this summons and who was living in daily fear of a knock on the door. A few minutes after 9 in the evening on Tuesday, April 3rd, just as Sanborn had put on his slippers and settled in at his desk, the knock came. When the unshod Sanborn opened his door and extended a hand to greet the stranger on his threshold, the stranger slapped on the handcuffs. With 4 burly assistants, burst in to wrestle him to a waiting carriage. The tall and gangly Sanborn, kicking and sputtering, protest all the way about warrants and authority, while his sister, Sarah, howled loud enough to raise the neighbors, then jumped the federal marshal, kicking, screaming, and pulling his beard so hard he dropped her brother to the ground, while their neighbor Mary Brooks rushed up and down the street crying bloody murder. Wow, the women. The women were fighting back. Soon everyone on Sudbury Road was pouring out of their houses. Someone ran to the first parish and started the church bell tolling, which roused Thoreau to what he at first thought was a fire. Yes, indeed, he later said, the hottest fire he'd ever witnessed in Concord. While Sanborn was kicking in the side of the carriage, a dozen people held back the horses. Others pelted the carriage with rocks, and Anna Whiting squeezed inside to wail on the driver while her father, Colonel Whiting, tried to whip the horses on. John Keyes ran to the melee, sized up and tore off to the home of Judge Thoreau, who scribbled out a writ of habeas corpus, which Keynes thrust into the face of the marshals, who refused to recognize it until the county deputy sheriff explained to them that if they did not release Sanborn, he personally would call on the citizens of Concord, by now numbering well over 100, to take back their schoolmaster by force. This is the federal conflicting with the state and the local. Do we have instances where the state and the federal conflict? That persuaded the 5 marshals to unhand Sanborn, and the riot wound down. Before anyone was seriously injured, Sanborn armed himself with a 6-shooter and decamped to a neighbor's while Henry Thoreau took up watch. At the Sanborns' least the federal marshals returned in the night. The next morning, Sanborn and Keyes appeared before the state Supreme Court in Boston, while Judge Lemuel Shaw avoided the federal arrest warrant. Interesting. Federal. How do you do that? Word got back to Concord, where a cheering crowd of hundreds met Sanborn and Keyes as they stepped off the train to a cannon salute. Sanborn holding his manacled hands high in triumph. The crowd filed into the town hall for boisterous indignation, meeting on the theme of resistance to tyranny, embodied now by the beloved schoolmaster's manacled hands, which he again held high. Sanborn spoke, of course, and so did Reverend Reynolds, Emerson, Higginson, and Thoreau, to be sure, whose concluding words had them all roaring. Concord was being congratulated in the newspapers for conducting this affair in a, quote, a lawful and orderly manner. Unquote. No, we could not agree. Quote, the Concord people didn't ring the alarm bells according to law, they didn't cheer according to law, they didn't groan according to law. And as he didn't talk according to law, he thought he would stop and give way to some other speaker. 15 years ago, Concord had jailed Thoreau for resistance to civil law. Now they hailed him as the leader of their ununited civil disobedience. That's a change of circumstances. Did you hear that? Sanborn. Now we should stop there. Sounds like a good end. We're going to end with civil disobedience. First he was jailed, and then he was acclaimed. 465, page 465. Now he's hailed as the leader of their united civil disobedience. We read about Charles Darwin and the girl next door, and about wild apples, ice forms. Humanity is one single family, all genetically related from 2 people from Africa. and how to wake up and take a walk in winter. So I'm trying to wake up and go out in the wintertime for a walk with Thoreau.